Donald Trump was a man of power, a figure who had long dominated the worlds of business and politics. His name was synonymous with towering skyscrapers, lavish hotels, and the kind of wealth most people could only dream of. Yet, on that particular day, something happened that no one could have predicted. It was an ordinary afternoon in the heart of the city, where the contrast between success and struggle was more apparent than ever. The streets bustled with people moving in every direction. Some in tailored suits, others in worn-out clothes, their lives dictated by vastly different circumstances. The city itself was a landscape of extremes, a place where the richest of the rich coexisted with those who had nothing but the cold pavement beneath them. Donald Trump had just stepped out of a grand building, surrounded by his usual entourage. Cameras flashed, voices called his name, and the world moved as it always did in his presence. Fast, demanding, relentless. But then, amidst the blur of motion and noise, a single moment changed everything. A man, ragged and weary, sat hunched against the side of a building, his face shadowed by a life that had been anything but kind. His clothes were tattered, his hands weathered by years of hardship, his eyes carrying the weight of stories no one had ever cared to hear. People passed him by as if he were invisible. It was the way the city worked. Those who had lost everything became nothing more than background scenery, ignored, forgotten. But as Trump moved past, something made him stop. It was unclear what caught his attention, the defeated look in the man's eyes, the silent plea hidden beneath his rough exterior, or perhaps something deeper, something that couldn't be explained by logic alone. The world around him kept moving, but for a brief moment, Trump stood still. His security detail hesitated, waiting for him to keep walking, but he didn't. He turned, looked at the man, and did something that left everyone around him in stunned silence. Instead of moving on, instead of brushing past as so many before him had done, he reached into his pocket. But it wasn't for money. It wasn't for a simple gesture to ease his conscience. He did something that was far more unexpected. He spoke. No one could hear what he said at first. The street was too loud, the honking of horns, the murmur of crowds, the clicking of cameras all drowning out whatever was happening in that moment. But what was clear was the expression on the man's face: surprise, disbelief, as if he himself couldn't understand why, of all people, Donald Trump had stopped for him. And in that moment, something shifted. The crowd that had once ignored the man began to take notice. Some paused, others turned their heads. The energy in the air changed, as if for the first time this man, who had once been invisible, was being seen. But what had made Trump stop? What had pulled him out of his world of power and wealth to acknowledge someone society had cast aside? No one knew yet, but they would soon find out, because what happened next would be a story that no one would ever forget. If you believe in leadership, power, and second chances, this is the place for you. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to never miss an inspiring Trump story. Donald Trump stepped out of the grand entrance of a luxurious hotel, the kind of place where opulence was on full display, where chandeliers cast golden light upon marble floors and every inch of the space exuded prestige. He had just concluded an important meeting, one of many that filled his schedule, surrounded by a team that moved with precision, ensuring that every second of his time was accounted for. The streets outside were alive with movement, the hum of traffic mixing with the conversations of pedestrians, the air thick with the aroma of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe, the occasional honk of impatient drivers adding to the city's restless symphony. As he descended the steps, his presence commanded attention. Passers-by turned their heads, some pulling out phones to capture a fleeting glimpse of the man who had become a symbol of power and controversy. His security team moved swiftly, forming a barrier between him and the unpredictable world outside, their eyes scanning every face, every movement. But amidst the sea of faces, one stood out. A man hunched over, his clothes hanging loosely from his frail frame, his skin marked by years of hardship. His beard was unkempt, his hair matted from days, perhaps weeks, without shelter. His hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or sheer exhaustion. It was impossible to tell. He was not a part of the city's rhythm, not a name anyone recognized. He was just another soul lost in the margins, a figure that people avoided eye contact with as they rushed past, as if acknowledging his presence would somehow make them responsible for his suffering. He moved toward the group, hesitant, his posture betraying a lifetime of rejection. His voice, rough from disuse, barely rose above a whisper as he spoke. He didn't ask for much, only a bite to eat, a scrap of kindness in a world that had long since turned its back on him. His words carried no expectation, only the quiet resignation of someone who had asked too many times before, only to be ignored. The moment stretched, tension crackling in the air as security instinctively stepped forward, prepared to usher him away like so many others before him. But before they could act, something unexpected happened. Trump raised a hand, a simple gesture that halted their movement, and in that instant, the entire dynamic shifted. He did not avert his gaze, did not dismiss the man as just another unfortunate soul in the endless cycle of poverty. Instead, he looked at him, truly looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time, as if recognizing something in his eyes that the rest of the world had failed to notice. The murmurs in the crowd faded as people turned to witness the unfolding scene. This was not a rehearsed moment, not a carefully curated event for the cameras. It was raw, unscripted, an act that defied expectations. Instead of brushing past, instead of offering a hurried nod of sympathy before moving on, Trump did something no one anticipated. He spoke. His voice, firm yet measured, cut through the noise, carrying with it a weight that made the man straighten his posture ever so slightly, as if, for the first time in a long while, someone had acknowledged his existence. The words were not condescending, nor were they empty gestures of pity. There was a question, a genuine curiosity about how this man had ended up here. What path had led him to this moment, standing before one of the most powerful figures in the world, their lives divided by an invisible chasm that few ever dared to cross. The security team exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. This was not how things were done. The public, too, watched with growing astonishment, cameras capturing the moment as it unfolded. In a city where indifference was the norm, where the forgotten remained forgotten, this act stood out, defied expectations. And as the conversation began, as Trump leaned in just slightly to better hear the man's words, a realization settled over the crowd. This was not just another fleeting interaction. This was something different, something no one would soon forget. The man standing before Donald Trump, hesitant and weary, introduced himself as Michael. His voice, though rough from years of hardship, carried the remnants of a past where he had once spoken with confidence. There was a time when he had not been just another invisible soul in the crowd, a time when his name had meant something. He had once had a job, a home, a family. He had once walked these same streets, not as a man begging for scraps, but as someone with a purpose, someone who had built a life through hard work and determination. But life, as he had come to learn, could be merciless. It could strip away everything in an instant, leaving only the echoes of what once was. Michael had been an electrician, skilled with his hands, trusted by clients who relied on him to bring light where there was darkness. His work had been steady, his income enough to support his wife and daughter. He had never considered himself wealthy, but he had been comfortable, able to afford the small luxuries that made life meaningful. A dinner out with his family, a weekend, trip to the countryside, the ability to buy his daughter a new pair of shoes without worrying about next month's rent. He had been proud of what he had built, proud of the life he had carved out through sheer determination. But fate had not been kind. It had started with an injury. A fall from a faulty ladder at a job site left him unable to work for months. The pain was unbearable, but the weight of financial ruin was worse. The medical bills began to pile up, each notice in the mail another, reminder of his helplessness. His savings, carefully built over years of sacrifice, drained faster than he ever thought possible. He tried to push through, to work through the pain, but the injury had left him weaker, slower. Clients who once depended on him began to look elsewhere. The phone calls stopped, the jobs dried up. And then, as if the universe had conspired against him, his wife fell ill. Without health insurance, the costs were staggering. He sold what little he could, trying to keep them afloat, but it was never enough. The eviction notice came one cold morning, nailed to the door of the apartment they had called home for over a decade. They had nowhere to go. His wife, already frail, did not survive long after. The loss shattered him in ways he could not describe. His daughter, now a teenager, was taken in by a distant relative, someone more stable, someone who could provide what he no longer could. He had told her it was temporary, that he would get back on his feet, that he would come for her soon. But months passed, then years, and he had never been able to keep that promise. Michael paused, his voice trembling, the weight of his past pressing against him. He had never spoken these words aloud to a stranger before, never shared the full extent of his downfall. And yet, as he stood before Trump, a man whose world could not be more different from his own, he felt compelled to tell the truth. Trump, known for his relentless schedule, for his ability to cut through conversations with efficiency, did something unexpected. He listened, not with impatience, not with the hurried nods of someone eager to move on, but with real attention. His eyes did not wander, his posture did not shift with boredom. Instead, he asked questions. What had Michael done before life had unraveled? Had he tried reaching out for help? What did he want most if given a second chance? Michael hesitated. No one had asked him that in years, not in a way that mattered, not in a way that suggested they were truly willing to do something about it. He had stopped dreaming long ago, had stopped believing in second chances. But in that moment, faced with a man who had built his empire from the ground up, who had risen despite the odds, he found himself allowing a sliver of hope to take root. For the first time in a long while, Michael did not feel invisible. He did not feel like just another statistic in a city that had long since stopped caring. And as he stood there, his story, laid bare before one of the most powerful men in the country, something inside him shifted. He did not know it yet, but this was the moment that would change everything. Donald Trump's journey is filled with resilience, bold decisions, and unforgettable moments. Stay inspired. Like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to be part of this movement. Donald Trump, after listening to Michael's story with an intensity that few had ever afforded the man, did something that no one in the crowd could have expected. He did not offer a dismissive nod of sympathy. He did not reach for his wallet to hand over a few bills before moving on. Instead, he did something far more significant, something that defied every assumption people had about him. He turned to Michael and invited him to join him for a meal. The air around them seemed to shift in an instant. The security team exchanged uncertain glances, their training having prepared them for 1,000 different scenarios, but not for this. Michael, too, seemed frozen for a moment, as if he had misheard. He had spent years being ignored, overlooked, brushed aside like an afterthought in a city that never stopped moving. To be acknowledged was one thing, but to be treated as an equal, to be invited to sit at the same table as one of the most powerful men in the world, that was something else entirely. He hesitated, his instinct telling him that this could not be real, that surely there had been some mistake. But Trump, with the same decisiveness that had built his empire, did not wait for an answer. He gestured toward a high-end restaurant just across the street, one of those places where the elite gathered behind velvet ropes, where men in crisp suits and women in designer dresses dined under crystal chandeliers, where a man like Michael would never dream of stepping foot. The invitation was not merely a meal, it was a statement. It was a challenge to the invisible barriers that separated people like Michael from the rest of the world. As they crossed the street, the reaction was immediate. Bystanders whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to capture the moment. others standing in stunned silence, unsure if they were witnessing an act of genuine kindness or something else entirely. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted the moment they entered. Conversations dimmed, eyes turned. The maître d', dressed in impeccable attire, straightened with visible uncertainty, his gaze flickering from Trump to the disheveled man beside him. Yet Trump carried himself with the same unwavering confidence he always did, as if there was nothing unusual about any of this. With a simple nod, a table was arranged. The staff, accustomed to serving dignitaries and celebrities, moved quickly, though some exchanged quiet glances, unable to mask their curiosity. Other diners, seated at their tables, observed the scene with a mixture of intrigue and disbelief. Michael, still struggling to believe what was happening, hesitated before lowering himself into the chair across from Trump. The contrast between them could not have been more stark. One, a man who had built an empire, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. The other, a man who had spent years living in the shadows of the city, his clothes worn and tattered, his hands calloused from hardship. And yet, for the first time in a long time, Michael did not feel like an outsider. A waiter approached, his professionalism barely concealing his astonishment. Trump, without hesitation, gestured for Michael to order whatever he wanted. The menu, filled with dishes that cost more than Michael had seen in months, was overwhelming. He hesitated, uncertain, but Trump dismissed his reluctance with a simple statement: "Get whatever you want." It was not spoken as a gesture of charity, but as a simple fact, as if, in this moment, Michael was no different from anyone else in the room. As the meal arrived, Trump did something even more surprising. He did not eat in silence, nor did he let the moment pass as a mere transaction of generosity. Instead, he spoke to Michael as he would to any business associate, asking real questions, expecting real answers. What had he done before life took this turn? What had he once dreamed of? What skills did he still have? Michael, still overwhelmed, answered cautiously at first, but as the conversation continued, he found himself speaking more freely, his words gaining strength. The other diners, though, trying to focus on their own meals, found themselves unable to look away. It was not just the presence of Trump that held their attention, but the sheer improbability of what was happening. This was not a scripted moment, not a polished PR stunt, carefully orchestrated for cameras. It was something raw, something real. And for Michael, it was something he had not felt in a long time: dignity. The meal stretched longer than anyone expected. Trump was not rushing through it, not treating it as an obligation to be fulfilled before moving on. He was listening, truly listening, treating Michael as someone worth his time, worth his energy, worth an opportunity. And as the conversation continued, as the murmurs around them turned into silent observation, one undeniable truth settled over everyone who bore witness to that moment. This was not just an act of generosity. This was the beginning of something more. Donald Trump had always been a man who could read people. Over decades of building his empire, he had developed an instinct for recognizing potential, for identifying those who had the drive to succeed but had been dealt the wrong cards. As he listened to Michael speak, he began to see something beyond the surface of hardship and loss. He saw a man who had once built a life through skill and determination, a man who had worked with his hands, who understood responsibility, who had endured more than most could fathom, and yet still carried the remnants of resilience in his voice. This was not someone beyond saving. This was someone who needed just one real chance. As the meal continued, Trump's mind worked quickly. He was not one to dwell in empty gestures, nor was he interested in providing charity for the sake of appearances. If he was going to help Michael, he was going to do it in a way that mattered. He began asking more precise questions, steering the conversation towards skills, experience, and the possibilities that lay ahead. He wanted to know what Michael had done in the past, what he was capable of doing now, and more importantly, whether he was ready to step forward if given the chance. Michael, still overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the moment, hesitated. No one had spoken to him like this in years. No one had asked him what he could do, only what he needed. The world had conditioned him to believe that his story ended with loss, that his place was permanently set among the forgotten. But Trump was not offering him pity. He was offering him a path back. And as the realization sank in, Michael began to speak more confidently. He told Trump about his years as an electrician, about the jobs he had worked, the skills he still had despite the time that had passed. He spoke of the projects he had completed, the satisfaction he once felt in doing work that mattered, the life he had before everything fell apart. Trump nodded as he listened, his expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, he reached for his phone. The movement was so natural, so immediate, that Michael didn't even register what was happening at first. The restaurant, still caught in the quiet disbelief of the moment, seemed to hold its breath as Trump pressed a contact and brought the phone to his ear. His voice, always commanding, cut through the air as he greeted the person on the other end, a business associate, someone he trusted, someone who could make decisions that mattered. Trump didn't waste time with small talk. He got straight to the point. He explained that he was sitting across from a man who had been through hell but had the skills and the determination to work. He spoke about Michael's experience, about the jobs he had done before, about the fact that life had knocked him down but had not destroyed his ability to contribute. He didn't ask for a favor. He made it clear that Michael was not being given a handout. He was being given a chance. A real opportunity, the kind that most people in his position never got. The conversation was brief, decisive. Trump listened for a moment, then nodded. A job, not in a week, not in a month, now. A company that needed skilled labor, a position that had just opened, a place where Michael could start immediately, where he could earn, work, rebuild. Trump ended the call with the same confidence that had defined every deal he had ever made and turned back to Michael, his expression firm. "You start tomorrow," he said. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't speak at first, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. A few moments ago, he had been another man lost in the shuffle, another forgotten soul on the street. And now, in the space of one conversation, everything had changed. He searched Trump's face for any sign that this was anything but real, but all he found was certainty. Around them, the realization settled in. The restaurant staff, the security team, the patrons who had been watching in stunned silence, all of them now fully grasped the weight of what had just happened. This was not just an act of kindness. This was a life being changed in real time. For the first time in years, Michael felt something he thought had been lost forever. Hope. Not the distant, fleeting kind that came from wishful thinking, but the tangible kind that came from knowing that the future had shifted, that the road ahead was no longer a dead end. He tried to speak, to thank Trump, but his voice faltered. Trump simply nodded, as if to say that words were unnecessary. Actions had already spoken louder than anything else ever could, and as Michael sat there, still reeling from the weight of the moment, one question filled the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Had Donald Trump really just changed this man's life forever? The answer was clear. Yes, he had. Word of what had just happened did not remain within the walls of that restaurant. The moment Trump had reached for his phone, securing a job for a man who had, just hours before, been resigned to the unforgiving streets, the world around him had already begun to take notice. People had been watching from the moment he had invited Michael to sit at his table, their initial shock turning into silent reverence as they witnessed a scene that defied their expectations. At first, there was only curiosity, disbelief even. Patrons of the restaurant exchanged glances, their conversations hushed. The waitstaff, trained to move unnoticed in the presence of high-profile guests, struggled to maintain their usual composure. Some simply stared, unable to reconcile the image they had in their minds of Donald Trump, the businessman, the political figure, the symbol of power, with the man now sitting across from someone the world had forgotten. Then, as realization sank in, hands reached for phones. It started with a single person at a nearby table, instinctively opening the camera app, unsure whether they were documenting a moment of genuine generosity or something else entirely. The screen captured Trump leaning in, engaged, listening with a focus that suggested this was not a performance. Then, others followed. A few silent seconds of hesitation gave way to movement, and soon, multiple angles of the same moment were being recorded, posted, shared, sent through message threads and social media feeds that stretched far beyond the restaurant. The first comments were simple reactions, bursts of surprise from people who had stumbled upon the footage online. The phrases varied, but the sentiment remained the same. "I never expected this. This is not something you see every day. Trump helping a homeless man? This is different." Then, the disbelief turned into debate. Some questioned whether it was real, whether this was staged, whether it was another calculated move. Others dismissed the cynicism outright, arguing that no cameras had been positioned before Trump had made his decision, that the moment had unfolded naturally, that there had been no hesitation in his actions. As the conversations grew, the media took notice. First, the smaller blogs and independent journalists picked up the footage, writing quick summaries of the event, their headlines filled with speculation. Then came the larger outlets. The networks, always watching for anything involving Trump, could not ignore a story that was spreading at an alarming rate. Within hours, the headlines shifted from whispers in comment sections to full-blown coverage. Trump's unexpected act of generosity stuns onlookers. Donald Trump hires a homeless man on the spot. Here's what happened. A different side of Trump, viral video sparks debate. The reactions continued to evolve. Some saw it as a defining moment, proof that Trump was not merely the figure the media had painted him to be, but someone capable of seeing beyond status, beyond wealth, beyond politics. Others remained skeptical, unable to reconcile their perceptions of him with the act of kindness unfolding on their screens. Regardless of the differing opinions, one thing was undeniable. The story had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a conversation between two men in a restaurant. It was now a moment that millions were witnessing, dissecting, and discussing. And as the news spread, one question lingered in the minds of those watching. Was this a fleeting act? Or had Trump just altered the course of a man's life forever? The answer, they knew, would come soon enough. Every great leader leaves a legacy. Be part of the conversation. Smash that like button, share your opinion in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful Trump insights. Michael could hardly believe how quickly his life had changed. Just days before, he had been another nameless figure among the thousands lost in the shadows of the city, reduced to surviving on scraps of food and fleeting moments of human kindness. He had accepted his fate long ago, resigned to the idea that the world had moved on without him. But now, as he stood in a clean, well-lit room, wearing fresh clothes instead of the ragged layers he had grown used to, everything felt surreal. The job Trump had arranged for him was real. The call had been made, the details set in motion, and by the next morning, Michael had been standing inside a bustling workspace, surrounded by men and women who, like him, had come here to work, to earn, to build. He had not held a steady job in years, yet as soon as he picked up the tools, the muscle memory returned. The weight of the drill in his hands, the hum of machinery, the scent of freshly cut materials. These were sensations he had thought he would never experience again. But here he was, doing what he had once been proud of, his hands moving with precision, his body adjusting to the familiar rhythm of labor. The first day had been exhausting, not just physically, but emotionally. He had spent so long being treated as an outsider, as someone without worth, that it felt strange to be part of something. Again, but there was no mistaking it. This was not a temporary gesture, not a fleeting moment of charity. This was real work, real opportunity. And with each passing hour, the doubt that had lingered in the back of his mind began to fade. He was not a lost cause. He had never been. He had simply needed someone to believe in him when he no longer could. The job, however, was only one part of the transformation. Along with employment came stability, something he had not known in years. A place to sleep that was not a shelter filled with uncertainty. A bed that belonged to him, with clean sheets and a door that locked, keeping out the cold and the fear that had become his constant companions. A space where he could breathe, where he could begin to reclaim the pieces of himself that had been buried under years of hardship. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he stood in front of a mirror and did not see a stranger staring back. The face was leaner than he remembered, the lines deeper, the eyes still carrying traces of exhaustion. But there was something else there too, something that had been missing for far too long. A glimmer of purpose, a sense of worth. As the days turned into weeks, Michael began to rebuild not just his life, but his identity. He spoke to his daughter for the first time in years, his voice shaking as he told her that he was coming back, that he was no longer lost, that he was going to be the father she had always deserved. He walked into work each morning with his head held higher than before, feeling, for the first time in years, that he belonged. When he was finally asked about that day, about the moment everything had changed, he struggled to find the words. He had replayed it in his mind countless times, trying to understand how something so unexpected, so impossible, had happened to him. Without him, he finally said, his voice breaking under the weight of the truth, I would still be on the streets. There was no exaggeration in those words, no embellishment for the sake of drama. It was a fact. Without Trump stopping that day, without him taking the time to listen, to act, to use his influence not for a spectacle but for real change, Michael's story would have continued as it always had, a downward spiral with no end in sight. But that was not his story anymore. His story was now one of redemption, of resilience, of proof that sometimes all it took was one person willing to see past the surface, one person willing to reach out and say, you are not forgotten, and for that he would be forever grateful. Donald Trump had long been a figure of intense scrutiny, a man whose name evoked strong opinions on both ends of the spectrum. To some, he was a ruthless businessman, a master strategist who played the world like a chessboard, always several moves ahead. To others, he was a leader who defied convention, a force of nature who shattered expectations and rewrote the rules of success. But for those who had only ever seen him through the lens of headlines and sound bites, there was a side to him that remained largely unexplored. The moment with Michael was not something that had been planned. There were no press releases, no carefully orchestrated cameras waiting to capture a perfect shot. It had begun as an unremarkable encounter on a busy street, one that could have gone unnoticed like so many before it. But instead of walking past, instead of treating the man as just another unfortunate soul in a world full of them, Trump had stopped. He had looked, listened, and acted in a way that few in his position ever would. For a man as powerful as he was, time was the most valuable commodity. Meetings, negotiations, decisions that shaped industries and economies, every second of his day was accounted for. And yet, in that moment, he had given something priceless, his attention, not as a politician seeking approval, not as a businessman closing a deal, but as a human being recognizing another's struggle. That, more than anything, was what had left people speechless. The media had long painted Trump in broad strokes, larger than life, polarizing, impossible to ignore. He was often depicted as either a relentless capitalist or an uncompromising leader, someone who thrived in conflict and reveled in power. But the act of helping Michael revealed something deeper, something that many had overlooked or dismissed. It showed a man who understood struggle, who respected hard work, who valued resilience. It showed that beneath the persona of the mogul, the tycoon, the political disruptor, there was still a man who believed in opportunity, in second chances, in the idea that no one's story was set in stone. Of course, as soon as the story spread, the inevitable debate began. Was this a genuine act of kindness, or was it another calculated move? The skepticism was immediate, as it always was with anything attached to his name. Critics speculated that it had been a perfectly timed public relations move, that the moment had been orchestrated to soften his image. Supporters, on the other hand, pointed to the raw, unscripted nature of the encounter, to the fact that no one had expected him to stop, to listen, to change the course of a stranger's life with a single phone call. But beyond the debate, beyond the endless commentary dissecting his motives, one truth remained undeniable. A man who had been invisible to the world was no longer forgotten. His life had been transformed not by a grand policy, not by a government program, but by the simple decision of one person to say, "You matter." And whether one viewed that moment as sincere or strategic, the result spoke for itself. Michael was working again. He had shelter. He had a future. He had hope. And so the question remained, lingering in the minds of those who watched the story unfold. Was this simply a moment of generosity? Or did it reveal something deeper about Trump that the world had never truly seen? The answer perhaps was not in words, but in the actions that followed. Because for Michael, and for those who had witnessed it firsthand, this was not a campaign speech or a soundbite. This was real. And in a world where real moments were rare, that alone was worth remembering. The story did not end with a job offer or a meal shared between two men from vastly different worlds. What had begun as an unexpected moment on a busy street had transformed into something far greater, a catalyst for change, a reminder that one decision, one moment of recognition could alter the course of a life. But the real question remained, what happened after? Did Michael truly rebuild, or was this just another fleeting gesture in a world quick to forget? The days following that encounter were filled with uncertainty for Michael, not because he doubted Trump's sincerity, but because he had spent too many years expecting things to fall apart. Life had been unkind to him, had shown him that even the best intentions often faded with time. But this time, something was different. The job Trump had arranged was not a symbolic gesture. It was real work, steady and structured, with a paycheck that allowed him to stand on his own feet again. At first, it was overwhelming. The world of employment, of responsibility, of structure was something he had been detached from for so long that it felt foreign. Waking up in a bed instead of on the pavement, having a place to go each morning where he was expected, where his presence mattered, these were things he had forgotten how to embrace. But slowly, day by day, he adjusted. His hands, though rough from years of hardship, remembered the skills that had once defined him. His mind, once dulled by survival mode, began to sharpen again. He learned quickly, worked hard, and within weeks, his supervisors took notice. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving, he was living. The weight of homelessness, of despair, of being invisible, began to lift. He was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he was building. His first paycheck felt surreal, holding it in his hands, knowing that he had earned it, knowing that he was no longer dependent on the kindness of strangers, was a victory he could hardly describe. And with it came something even more valuable than money, dignity. As his confidence grew, so did his ambitions. He reached out to his daughter, the young girl he had once been forced to leave behind. Their first conversation was hesitant, filled with the ghosts of years apart, but as the weeks turned into months, the distance between them began to close. He was no longer a man with nothing to offer. He was no longer a father who had failed. He was a man rebuilding, a father proving that redemption was possible, and while his life changed, the world continued to talk about the moment that had set it all in motion. The video of Trump stopping, of him listening, of him taking action, had spread further than anyone anticipated. It had been analyzed, debated, criticized, praised, but beyond the media frenzy, beyond the political narratives that tried to attach meaning to it, there was an undeniable truth. People were paying attention. Other business leaders, inspired by what they had seen, began to rethink their own approach to those in need. Some quietly reached out to shelters and organizations, offering employment to those who had fallen through the cracks. Others took the moment as a lesson, a reminder that real change did not always come from policies or grand speeches, but from individual choices. The conversation had shifted. People began to ask themselves, what can I do? What power do I have to change even one life? Trump himself never spoke much about the moment after it happened. He had never sought credit, had never used it as a talking point in speeches or interviews. He had simply done what he felt was right in that moment, what his instincts had told him to do. And perhaps that was what made it so powerful. It had not been planned. It had not been calculated. It had simply been an act of recognizing someone who had been ignored for too long. Michael's journey was not easy. The scars of the past did not vanish overnight, but he was proof that even the smallest spark of hope, if nurtured, could grow into something unstoppable. His story, once one of loss and despair, had become one of resilience. And it all started because one man chose to stop, to listen, to act. In the end, the true legacy of that moment was not just in the life that was changed, but in the message it carried, that sometimes the most powerful thing one can do is to see the unseen, to acknowledge the forgotten, to believe in those who have stopped believing in themselves. And as long as people remembered that, the impact of that single act of kindness would continue to ripple outward, far beyond the walls of that restaurant, far beyond the headlines, far beyond the lives of two men who crossed paths on an ordinary day that became extraordinary. Donald Trump had always been a man of action. Throughout his life, he had built, negotiated, and shaped the world around him with a relentless drive. He was not someone who waited for opportunities. He created them. And on that day, in what had begun as an ordinary moment, he had chosen to create an opportunity for someone who had none. Michael's life had been rewritten in the most unexpected way, not through a government program, not through a carefully orchestrated act of charity, but through a single decision, a moment where one man had chosen to see another, to listen, to act. The impact of that decision rippled far beyond the two of them. It was not just about a job, a meal, or even a second chance. It was about the fundamental truth that a single moment of recognition could alter the course of a life. What could the world learn from this? That power is not just about influence or wealth, but about the willingness to use it for something meaningful. That leadership is not only measured in policies or boardroom deals, but in the way one chooses to engage with the world. That true change does not always come from sweeping reforms, but from the moments where individuals choose to step forward instead of walking away. It was easy to overlook those who had fallen through the cracks, to assume that their stories were over, that their circumstances were permanent. But Michael's journey proved otherwise. His life had not ended when he lost everything. It had not been defined by the moments that broke him, but by the moment when someone saw beyond his struggles and reminded him that his story was still being written. Trump had not just given him a job, he had restored something far more valuable: his dignity, his confidence, his belief that he was still capable of building a future. And in doing so, he had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful thing one can do is simply to acknowledge someone who has been ignored for too long. The question now was not about what Trump had done, but about what others could do. What if more people took a moment to truly see those around them? What if more leaders, more business owners, more individuals with the ability to help chose to extend a hand instead of turning away? What if the world stopped treating those who had fallen as if they were beyond redemption? One decision had changed Michael's life forever. One act of Generosity had given him the foundation to stand again. And if this story proved anything, it was that the smallest actions, when made with sincerity, when rooted in the belief that everyone deserves a chance, had the power to transform lives. Now, the challenge was for others to do the same, to recognize the power of a single moment, to understand that change did not require grand gestures, only the willingness to see beyond the surface, to believe that no one was truly lost as long as someone was willing to believe in them, because in the end, the legacy of that day was not just about one man's generosity, it was about the undeniable truth that kindness, when combined with action, had the power to rewrite destinies. And for those who understood this, for those who believed that one gesture could set a life on a new course, there was only one thing left to do: carry that lesson forward and make it their own. Strength, strategy, and vision. If these qualities inspire you, you're in the right place. Show your support by liking this video, commenting your thoughts, and subscribing for more.